The watch on the dresser didn't belong to me. It didn't belong to my wife either. It belonged to my brother. Steel bracelet, blue bezel, our father's initials scratched on the case back with the pocket knife he carried for 30 years. That was the hook in my mind when the rest of the evidence tried to explain itself. Not the sound of voices or the smell of cologne, not even the silence that met me when I said, "I'm home." Just a watch, face down, ticking through the second after the second that turned an ordinary Thursday into a record I would study later. My name is Michael. I work with numbers for a living and with people carefully. I don't take leaps when steps will do. On the drive back from the grocery store, I planned dinner in my head, salmon, broccolini, a decent Pinot, and texted my wife, Laura, that I'd swing by for ice because the freezer had that usual frost. She didn't respond. It wasn't strange. Not responding is one of those behaviors you don't notice until it sits next to something else, like a watch where no watch should be, or a door lock that's usually cracked for the cat. The house smelled like a candle she only burned for company. The music was off, which is to say I could hear the refrigerator hum and the air vents register their breath like a runner who insists she's not winded. I thought about saying my brother's name before I saw anyone, because words test a room, but I didn't. I put the bag on the counter and set the ice in the sink. I looked at the watch. It looked back with the kind of indifference only an object manages when it happens to be a witness. Here is what I did not do. I did not shout, demand, or rush. I identified the data points. Front door, locked from inside. Back door, deadbolt thrown, chain on. Laura's phone, not on the counter charger, plug warm to the touch. Guest room door, closed, not latched, a draft moving the bottom edge enough to ruffle dust bunnies. I called her name once, mild. I called it again, less a question than a note in a file I'd write later. I heard the soft thud of something set down, the exhalation that comes after two people decide which of them will speak first. When they came out, Laura first, robe tied, my brother Ethan second, hair wet like he'd rinsed and not toweled properly. I kept my hands at my sides. There is a point at which surprise is a choice. I did not choose it. I said hello. I nodded at the watch to show I'd noticed it and picked it up with 2 fingers as if I were checking a coin. "You left this," I said to Ethan and placed it in his palm. He couldn't meet my eyes, but he thanked me in a voice too formal for a kitchen we'd painted together the weekend before our wedding. I told them I was hungry. I pressed the oven to preheat and asked if anyone wanted salmon. Laura said she wasn't hungry. Ethan said he should go. I said yes, he should. He left his eyes on the floor all the way to the door. I watched his shoes move, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because facts like that anchor you when the rest of the room is trying to float. When the door closed, Laura reached for me and then didn't. I opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving. Calm is a habit, and like all habits, it pays off when you need it. I told her we would talk, but not then. Not while adrenaline was pretending to be clarity. She started to explain, mentions of loneliness, of drift, of this not meaning what I thought it meant. I held up a hand, not to silence her, but to slow the pace to one I could think at. I set the cork on the counter and aligned it with the bottle's seam because I wanted something in that room to line up. "Tonight," I said, "we're going to document what happened. Tomorrow we can decide what it means. If you're waiting for shock or shouting, you're going to be disappointed." The real sound was the clock on the stove, steady as traffic, and the smaller sound of the watch I had given back, ticking on my brother's wrist as he walked down our front steps. I plated the salmon. I ate alone. I left a portion covered for Laura. After the dishes, I sat at the dining table and made a list. Dates, names, locations, what I knew, what I suspected, what I would verify. The hook was the watch. The rest would be systems. People think betrayal is a storm. It is more like a ledger, entries, reconciliations, and a final balance that tells you where you truly stand. In the morning, the house did not look different. That matters. Chaos is dramatic, but in my experience, order hides the most. I brewed coffee and read the headlines out of habit. I don't like to let one story crowd out the world. Laura came down in a sweatshirt I bought her the winter we drove to Vermont and got snowed in at a motel with a broken heater. She didn't apologize immediately. I appreciated that. Apologies issued at the wrong altitude don't land, they circle. We sat at opposite sides of the table we assembled our first week here, when the only thing we owned that cost more than $200 was the mattress. I spoke first. I'm going to ask you questions, I said. Answer precisely. If a question feels unfair, say so, and I'll rephrase. It wasn't a courtroom. It was closer to an audit. The stakes were similar, verifying that the numbers matched the narrative. How long? 2 months. How many times? I don't know. Count, I said. She stared at the wood grain like it might offer courage. 7. Where? Once here. Mostly at his place. Once at a hotel after a work dinner. I did not ask why, not yet. Did you use protection? She nodded. Did you tell him you loved him? She shook her head. Did you tell him you loved me? She nodded again, which was both likely and useless. I need your consent to review the factual record, I said. Calendars, messages, anything that will help me understand the timeline. She agreed. I placed my phone between us and opened a document I'd titled Median, because it is the middle that tells you about a distribution, not the extremes. I recorded her answers. She watched, mouth firm. I have seen her strong in better contexts. It looked the same on her face now. Strength is agnostic. I thought about Ethan. We are not close the way television brothers are. We are close the way two men who shared a room until high school are fluent in each other's habits, wary of each other's claims. He is a firefighter, which means people thank him in public, and I am an analyst, which means people forget I was in the room. Both roles have their biases. He has always liked being seen. I have always liked seeing. When Laura went upstairs to shower, I didn't examine her phone. That boundary matters, too. She had agreed to show me what I asked for. I would ask for it later, cleanly, when we could turn a page together without tearing it. I did, however, open our cellular account on my laptop. I looked at the logs the way I look at cash flows. Not for the large numbers, but for the repeating ones. There they were, clusters of calls to Ethan's number bracketed by the hours she taught a morning fitness class. Messages stacked like cordwood on days I was in Houston for a client. The pattern matched her estimate. I appreciated that more than I wanted to. By lunch I had a schema. At the top, objective facts. Under that, inferred facts with confidence percentages. Under that, open questions. If I sound cold, understand that this is how I stay warm. To believe I have control over my choices, I need a framework that doesn't change its shape just because my life does. I sent Laura a calendar invite for 6 in the evening. Discussion, parameters, and next steps. I attached a short agenda. People make fun of agendas until they save them. Before the meeting that was my marriage, I called my mother. I told her we should have dinner this weekend, and that I would prefer it if Ethan wasn't there. She asked if we were arguing. I said, calmly, that we were in the middle of a significant disagreement and I needed space. She offered to mediate, an impulse she has never overcome. I told her no. She said she trusted me. She has never said those words so plainly. I appreciated that, too. At 6, Laura sat down with a notebook of her own. It was the one she used in graduate school for an ethics seminar. I took that as a gesture rather than a joke. I explained that for the next week we would sleep in separate rooms, that we would maintain privacy in communications, and that we would share schedules to minimize collisions. I would reach out to a counselor recommended by a colleague. She could choose whether to attend. I would also consult an attorney, not as an announcement of an outcome, but as a responsible act. The word responsible snapped the air. But responsibility has never been a luxury for me. It is how I get to the other side of things in one piece. I believe in verification. Trust, once dented, can be repaired, but only if the structure underneath holds. On Friday, I walked myself through the chain of custody of the week. Who had access to what, when, and with which incentives. I pulled bank statements, not because I suspected hidden expenses, but because money writes its own diary in a language with fewer synonyms. The charges were boring: groceries, gas, a hotel bar near the conference center 3 weeks ago. That last one lined up with a night I'd been told she had a late yoga workshop. Boredom is a relief until it isn't. I asked Ethan to meet me at a park we went to as kids. Neutral ground, open spaces, fewer walls for words to bounce off. He showed up in a department t-shirt and the same watch, which he had set 5 minutes fast since we were children. He says it makes him punctual. I know it makes him feel ahead. I want facts, I said. You will give them to me. You will not give me justifications. Those belong to each of us privately. He nodded. He has always responded well to rules when the referee is clear. He told me the basics. They match Laura's. He said he was ashamed. I told him he could keep that. Shame is a personal hobby, not a joint account. I asked him if anyone else knew. He said no. I told him to keep it that way. This story was not leaving my guardianship until I decided it could. He asked what I would do. I told him what I was doing. I was documenting, protecting assets, scheduling counseling, and notifying our parents that he should find other plans for the weekend. He thanked me for not hitting him. It was a strange thanks, and honest. Violence would have made him feel punished and me feel uncontrolled. I am not interested in either feeling. When I got home, Laura had printed her phone records. She had highlighted dates she believed were important. She had written explanations in the margins, not excuses. Notes like, "I was afraid to tell you I felt invisible, and this was the night you said you'd be late, and I hated myself for hoping you'd cancel." I read them the way a bartender reads stories, recognizing parts true, parts drunk. I added my own marginalia. I was in the next room the whole time, and you never asked. I booked an appointment with a lawyer named Carter, recommended by a colleague who had been through an amicable divorce and kept his house. Carter's office smelled like lemon oil and quiet decisions. He asked questions I had already asked myself and gave me answers I had already guessed. Community property, best case and worst case distributions. The value of being the first to act versus the second to escalate. We discussed temporary agreements for separation under the same roof, the logistics of living gently while deciding whether to continue living together at all. I left with a folder, a list, and the sense that the ground under me could bear weight. That night, Laura and I ate takeout at the dining table, the candle from the other day burning because there was nothing left to disguise. We spoke in ordinary voices about extraordinary things. What tells a person they are safe? How routine can be shelter and prison? Why love is sometimes mistaken for rescue? I did not offer absolution. She did not beg for it. We were two adults who had chosen each other once, and were now deciding what that choice meant in the presence of new data. The next morning I ran 6 miles by the river and returned with a clear head and a small plan, a timeline board on the wall of the office, discrete tasks we could complete whether we stayed married or not. Some would call it clinical. I call it humane. When you stop improvising and start arranging, you give yourself time to feel without being ruled by it. The hook had been a watch. The method was the same as ever. Measure, record, adjust. If there is a future here, it will be built like any durable structure, square, level, and on a foundation we test before we trust. Forgiveness is not a single moment of grace. It is a sequence of calculated, deliberate steps, each one tested before it is taken. I did not begin at forgiveness. I began at containment. When Laura asked for the chance to prove she could rebuild what she had broken, I didn't give her a speech about betrayal or pain. I let her speak until she was empty of words. Then I outlined my terms. The framework was clear: complete transparency with accounts, devices, and schedules, counseling twice a week, finances separated until I chose to merge them again, physical intimacy suspended until I believed trust had returned in measurable form. And Ethan, my brother, was to relocate to another city and have no contact with either of us outside of unavoidable family obligations. There would be no more accidental encounters, no chance for loose ends to fray what we were attempting to mend. Ethan didn't fight it, perhaps because he knew he had already lost the only ground that mattered. The early days of this arrangement were purely mechanical. In therapy, we sat like two negotiators at a conference table, voices even, statements precise. There was no pleading from her, no rage from me. The counselor guided us to talk about responsibility rather than blame, a subtle but crucial distinction. Laura admitted she had sought validation outside our marriage when she felt unseen. I told her plainly that pain was not permission. She did not contest that. Our counselor suggested we both keep written records. Hers, a journal of accountability; mine, an observation log. I was meticulous. Every act of transparency went into the log. Her phone left unlocked on the counter, her punctuality to therapy, the way she updated our shared calendar for even the smallest errands. These were small acts, but they were deliberate, and deliberate acts can build new foundations. I did not extend trust quickly. I expected adherence to our framework without exception, and Laura delivered. She respected my request for solitude, sometimes leaving the house entirely when I needed a clear space to think. She did not ask for timelines on forgiveness. This restraint spoke more than apologies could. Apologies are cheap without follow-through. Restraint is an ongoing investment. Over the first 6 weeks, my log showed a slow but undeniable pattern. Consistency, honesty, small efforts sustained over time. Forgiveness was still far off, visible only in the distance, but I could now see it as a fixed point on the map, rather than an uncertain rumor. And in my world, once something is charted, it can be reached. I have always believed that what gets measured can be improved. So I created the Rebuild Ledger, a document designed to strip the emotion out of tracking progress and replace it with the discipline of numbers. It had 3 columns: trust maintained, trust challenged, trust earned. I filled it daily, without fail. In the beginning, the earned column was mostly empty. Trust maintained filled steadily, Laura showing up to counseling on time, respecting my request for solitude, following through on commitments. Trust challenged was modest. Moments when I caught a shadow of suspicion in her voice, when she seemed to edit a story mid-sentence, even if the correction was harmless. I logged those too. Precision demands honesty, and I wasn't building a case for or against her. I was building a record. She began to participate in the process without being prompted. When she knew she'd be late from errands, she messaged me before I asked. She left her phone in plain sight, not for display, but as a habit. On 2 occasions, she handed me receipts from places I hadn't inquired about. These were not grand gestures. They were the slow, consistent brushstrokes that eventually make a painting whole. I also noted changes in myself. The first day, I went without checking her location history. I marked it in the ledger as trust maintained. The first time I felt no need to reread a text she had sent earlier, I marked it as trust earned. Trust is not a gift you give only once. It's a structure you keep repairing. I began to see that the repairs were holding. 2 months in, the ledger started to surprise me. The earned column grew steadily, sometimes more quickly than I expected. It was not just Laura proving herself. It was me allowing space for her to prove herself. I realized that forgiveness would not come in one dramatic revelation, but in the quiet arithmetic of daily life. Numbers that began to balance on their own. One evening, reviewing the ledger, I noticed an undeniable trend. The ratio of earned to challenged had reversed. This was no accident. It was the result of consistent actions meeting consistent expectations. The work was paying off. I closed the document and, for the first time in months, left my desk without the weight of suspicion following me. The ledger told the truth. We were moving towards something new, something that, while it would never erase the past, might be strong enough to hold the future. Trust can survive in theory, but theory is nothing without a test. The first real trial came sooner than I expected, a work trip to Chicago, for days away. It wasn't just the distance that mattered. It was the absence of my own eyes on the routine we'd been carefully building. Before I left, we sat down with the shared calendar and outlined a communication agreement. A text each morning before 9 a.m., an evening call before bed, and at least one photo from her day. It didn't need to be performative, no posed shots, just an honest capture of whatever she was doing. She met these expectations without fail. The morning texts came on time, some just a simple good morning and a note about the weather. The evening calls were steady, unforced. She told me what she'd made for dinner, how the cat had decided the laundry basket was a new throne, what her sister said about a podcast they were both listening to. The photos were ordinary, the steam rising from her coffee mug, the inside of her grocery cart, the view from her run. They were not curated for trust, they were trust. In the quiet of my hotel room, I realized how much the ordinariness mattered. Trust isn't built on dramatic reconciliations. It's built in the repetition of small, reliable actions. Each text, each call, each photo was a deposit into the account we were rebuilding. There was no overdraft. On the flight back, I thought about how I had not once checked her location history. Not once had I scrolled through old messages looking for inconsistencies. I hadn't avoided it out of discipline. The thought simply hadn't occurred. That absence of compulsion was worth noting in the ledger under trust earned. When I walked into the house, she was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. There was no performance in her welcome, no nervous overcompensation. She asked about my trip, listened to my answers, and didn't overfill the space with her own explanations. That, too, I logged. Sometimes trust is not in what is said, but in what doesn't need to be. That night, I reviewed the ledger. For the first time, The earned column for a single week outnumbered the combined total of maintained and challenged. It was a statistical anomaly I wanted to see repeated. This was no finish line, but it was undeniable evidence that we could cross the distance between us without losing sight of each other. The test had been passed. And passing a test means you prepare for the next one, knowing it will come without warning. But for that week, I allowed myself to stop preparing and simply live in the data we had created together. For months, I carried a knife, not a real one, but the mental kind, sharp with suspicion and memory. It was forged on that Thursday, honed every time my mind replayed the scene. The watch on the dresser, the robe tied hastily, the wet hair. This knife wasn't meant for use. It was meant for readiness, an instinct to protect myself from being cut again. But carrying it meant my hand was never free for anything else. The shift began quietly. One evening, I was reading in the living room, and a thought occurred to me, not about the betrayal, but about how long it had been since I had thought about the betrayal. I couldn't pinpoint the last time I'd replayed the details. I sat with that realization. The knife was still there, but I wasn't gripping it. This wasn't forgiveness. It was a loosening, the start of letting my arm rest from holding a weapon I might never need to use. I didn't announce it to Laura. Announcements invite expectations, and expectations can turn progress into performance. Instead, I logged it in the ledger. Trust maintained. Mental space clear for 8+ hours. Over the next few weeks, those stretches of clarity grew longer. They weren't perfect. There were still moments when a certain look, a certain pause in her voice, would make my hand twitch toward the knife. But the frequency and intensity diminished. I noticed I was more present in conversations, less inclined to read subtext into every word. The knife was no longer the first thing I reached for. One Saturday morning, we went to the farmer's market together for the first time since the incident. The last time we had walked those aisles, I had been on edge, scanning every interaction for signs of a hidden message or an unspoken truth. This time, I found myself debating the merits of one vendor's honey over another's, tasting samples without a parallel narrative running in my head. It felt like a return to something, not the past, but to a state of living that wasn't shadowed by suspicion. I began to understand that letting go of the knife wasn't about lowering my guard entirely. It was about reallocating energy. Constant vigilance drains more than it protects. By easing my grip, I had room to hold other things, conversations, plans, even moments of unguarded laughter. One night, while cooking dinner, Laura reached over and touched my hand lightly, a casual gesture she hadn't tried in months. I didn't flinch. That absence of reaction was worth more than any planned milestone. It was unplanned, unmeasured in the moment, but afterward I wrote it down. Trust earned, physical contact without recoil. The knife still exists. I know exactly where it is in my mind, and I know I could pick it up if necessary. But it rests in a drawer now, not in my palm. And there's a kind of strength in that. The strength to keep living without always preparing for the next wound. It was a Tuesday evening, quiet except for the sound of rain on the kitchen windows. Laura and I were finishing dinner, pasta with a simple tomato sauce, when she put down her fork, looked directly at me, and asked, "What do you need to feel safe with me again?" It was the first time she had asked that question so plainly. Not, "What can I do to make you happy?" or "How do I fix this?" but about safety. She understood that safety had to come before everything else. I didn't answer immediately. I wanted my reply to be clear, actionable, and unambiguous. I need honesty even when it's inconvenient. I need you to acknowledge boundaries without testing them. I need no secrecy around communication, phones, messages, calls. And I need you to respect my need to verify things without taking it as an accusation. She didn't push back, didn't try to negotiate softer terms. She simply nodded. That acceptance was worth recording in my ledger. Trust earned. Agreement to specific safety parameters without resistance. Over the next weeks, I saw her put these principles into action. If she was going to be late, she told me before I asked. She left her phone face up on the counter, notifications visible, without comment. She volunteered information about her day without over-explaining. I noticed that these acts were not accompanied by nervous energy. They were becoming habits. One afternoon, I came home earlier than expected. Laura was on the couch, reading. She looked up, smiled, and didn't scramble to close a laptop or put away a phone. That unguarded reaction told me more than any scheduled check-in could. I logged it as trust earned. No behavioral change upon unexpected arrival. We also discussed boundaries with Ethan. Even though he had moved away, she agreed that any necessary family communication involving him would be relayed through me. This was not a measure of control. It was a safeguard, a mutual understanding of where vulnerabilities existed. The agreement went into the ledger, but more importantly, it went into my internal framework of what safety looked like. Perhaps the most telling change was in the silences between us. Early on, those silences had been tense, each of us wondering what the other was thinking. Now, they were easier. We could sit in the living room reading separate books or cook in shared quiet, without the need to fill the space with assurances. That Tuesday conversation marked a turning point. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no emotional crescendo. But it was the moment I realized we were moving from repairing the damage to reinforcing the structure. The ledger showed progress, but this conversation gave it context. It was no longer about tallying actions. It was about aligning on what safety meant for both of us and committing to it without conditions. Our counselor suggested we create a symbolic act to mark the transition from rebuilding to living again. It needed to be something intentional, something that recognized the work we had done and the distance we still had to travel. Laura took a week to decide what hers would be. When she finally handed me the envelope, she didn't try to explain it. She just said, "This is for you to read when you're ready." I waited until the house was quiet that evening. Sitting at my desk, I opened the envelope and unfolded several handwritten pages. The letter wasn't a plea for forgiveness or a list of justifications. It was an acknowledgement, a detailed accounting of her actions, their impact, and the harm they caused. She described the night in plain terms, without euphemisms. She admitted to selfishness, to seeking validation without considering the cost, and to underestimating the strength of the person she had betrayed. Reading it, I felt a strange mixture of heaviness and clarity. The weight came from seeing the betrayal laid out so plainly. The clarity came from realizing she was not hiding from the truth anymore. For months, part of my suspicion had been tied to the idea that there might still be pieces of the story untold. This letter dismantled that fear. There were parts that hurt to read, not because they were new, but because they were thorough. She wrote about how my silence in the months before had made her feel invisible, and how instead of speaking directly to me, she had chosen an easier, more destructive path. She admitted it was cowardice. There was no flattery to soften the edges, no attempts to minimize her choice. What struck me most was the section about Ethan. She didn't frame it as a moment of passion or a temporary lapse. She called it a betrayal of both her husband and her own values. She wrote that she had thought about what kind of person she wanted to be, and how that night had taken her further from it than she ever thought possible. It was not just an apology, it was an indictment she had written against herself. When I finished reading, I didn't feel a dramatic shift. Forgiveness is not a switch. But I did feel a layer of suspicion lift, replaced by a cautious respect for her willingness to confront herself on paper. I put the letter back in the envelope and locked it in my desk. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I wanted it kept safe as a record of what had been said, something to look back on if the trust we were building ever felt uncertain again. That night, I wrote in the ledger, "Trust earned, full acknowledgement without deflection or omission." It was the single longest entry I had made. And while the numbers on the page still mattered, I realized that this was the kind of act that no metric could fully capture. 6 months after the watch on the dresser, I told Laura I forgave her. The words were deliberate, measured, and free from ceremony. There was no embrace, no tearful catharsis. We were sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, coffee cooling in front of us. I simply said, "I forgive you." Forgiveness, I'd learned, isn't forgetting. It's not the absence of pain or the erasure of history. It's a decision to stop collecting interest on a debt that has been repaid through consistent action. Laura had met every condition we agreed upon and had done so without protest or manipulation. She had submitted herself to a process that required discipline from both of us. And I had seen enough evidence to close the ledger, not because the balance was perfect, but because the account was no longer in deficit. When I said the words, she didn't rush to thank me. She nodded, as if she understood that this was not a gift but a mutual achievement. That in itself showed me how far we'd come. Early on, She might have clung to those words as absolution. Now she seemed to know they were simply another step forward. We didn't return to the marriage we had before. That marriage ended the moment I saw the watch. Instead, we built something new, brick by brick, on ground we had tested and reinforced. There were still cracks, there always will be, but they were visible, acknowledged, and monitored. We didn't pretend they weren't there. The watch is still in the drawer where I put it that night. I've thought about throwing it away, but I decided against it. Not because I want to hold on to the pain, but because it's part of the record. In business, you don't erase a loss from the books. You note it, you learn from it, and you move on with better systems in place. Life after forgiveness isn't lighter, it's steadier. There's a weight to choosing to stay that rivals the weight of leaving. But it's a weight I carry willingly now. We still have our twice-a-month counseling sessions, not because we're in crisis, but because maintenance is cheaper than repair. We still talk about boundaries, still check in about how we're doing with the agreements we made. That Sunday morning, after we cleared the table, I went to my desk and closed the ledger for the last time. I didn't destroy it. Like the watch, it stays in its place, not to be reopened unless absolutely necessary, but there as a reminder of what was rebuilt and how. The numbers told the story of our recovery, but the choice to forgive was mine alone. Forgiveness was never about erasing what happened. It was about deciding that the future we could build together was worth more than the past we couldn't change. And that, more than any apology or grand gesture, is what made me put the pen down and stop keeping score.